It's a privilege to be on the stage with these two men who have certainly written some of the most definitive texts. Just to give an introduction, Douglas Rushkoff is a writer, lecturer, and media theorist, author of books like Cyberspace, Ecstasy Club, Coercion, Exit Strategy, now a writer of Testament on Vertigo, as well as you have now Get Back in the Box, specifically for businessmen, is that correct? And Scott McCloud, comics creator and theorist, renowned creator of Zot, coined the 24-hour comic, and of course, understanding comics, reinventing comics, and making comics. So please welcome them here today. And the basic premise of this was to see what happens when you get a writer and media theorist sitting at the table with a comics theorist to talk about what is comics as a medium. And so I guess, Douglas, I want to start with you actually as an entry point, how you came to comics.
Or at least came back to comics, I guess. I mean, I was a comics kid. In the late 80s, early 90s, when sort of the pre-internet was happening, I got really interested in trying to write a book that could explain the kind of hypertext, hyperdelic, fantasy role-playing, rave, fractal society that was emerging to people who didn't get that. You know, to the people who would laugh at you when you said you might someday be using email, which they did. They laughed at us. So I went around and looked at a lot of different cultures, and it occurred to me that the big difference was sort of between Euclidean mathematics and chaos mathematics. Who is dedicated to smoothing out the roughness of reality, and who is dedicated to surfing the roughness of reality for everything it's worth? So you have sort of the Euclideans on the one side, and then the Mandelbrot kind of fractal-loving snowboarders on the other. So how do you explain the difference between skiing and snowboarding, between walking and skateboarding, between playing Chutes and Ladders versus playing a video game, between team sports versus extreme sports? They all seemed to share this same quality of actually mining chaos for value versus avoiding chaos for decorum and clarity and linearity. So my whole life really was about the difference between this sort of linear narrative way of looking at the world, which I thought had pretty much ruined Western civilization over 2,000 years of crisis, climax, relief, sort of the male orgasm curve of understanding, whether it's applied to socialism or communism or Christianity or anything. And then this other sort of more Simpsonian, mystery science theater sense of making connections between things and enjoying resonances and connection rather than just conclusion. And it always seemed to me like comics had some of that quality, in that comics were trying to tell a story sequentially and linearly at the same time. That comics bridged these two worlds. And I couldn't quite express it, but I knew there was something in there, that sort of low culture versus high culture, the sort of media viral quality of comics to release really potent ideas in seemingly candy shells, that comics embodied a lot of the seeming contradictions in a society moving from one state to the other. And then a friend of mine, who was my main sort of Mecha Gundam teacher, said, "Oh, well, you've got to read Understanding Comics," which I think was in its pre-Harper version. There were like 3 versions.
93.
It wasn't the gold one, but it was the one before the current one. And it was like, I mean, I'm a guy who's raised on Ong and McLuhan and Postman, right? That's where I come from. And then here's a guy who, with a pun, saying Understanding Comics is a pun on Understanding Media. He's saying, "Come to me, Douglas. I understand what you're saying and more." So it basically, I read that and went, "Oh my God, that this isn't just a suspicion about what comics are and can be. This is what comics are and can be. And the part that got me, of course, the most enthusiastic was this part about the gutter, where you basically say that comics communicate as much or more in the gutter between panels as they do in the panels themselves. And he has that great thing where he has the guy before the idea and the guy after the idea with the light bulb, but the finding of the idea is between the two. So what I wanted to do was write a comic book that took place in the gutters, which is what I ended up doing with this one called Testament, and it sort of, for me, made sense because I think everything takes place in the gutter. But to have one story sort of be happening in the panels and the other, like sort of those old Aragonius things, happening between the panels, so I could actually play with the two narratives and take your idea sort of in my direction, which is to say, let's not have an inferred gutter. Let's actually live in the gutter. Let's live in the gutter at the same time that we're trying to tell the other kind of story. But then I always wanted to meet him, and finally did when you got him to NYU ITP, where I teach with you, and was like, he is real. And then always had, I think it might have been Jeff Newell actually, who had the idea to try to get us together on a thing, because we kind of come from different worlds, but reached a very similar place and set of conclusions about what they mean.
Yeah.
Do you have a response?
I do. I don't know that I can follow that up adequately. I would get pretty fractal pretty quickly. Probably best to move on to the next topic. But that was a great rant. I just love listening to that. No, I don't have a direct response yet, but don't worry, I'll warm up soon. Try a different question on me, and we'll get a different answer.
Okay. Well. I guess one of the things that drew me to this conversation certainly was that I think of both of you as writing texts that really definitively influenced a very specific time, generation, and certainly spoke about where technologies were and all sorts of things in a very, very specific way. And so I guess now, maybe 12 years later, in terms of that, what are your thoughts on that in terms of not necessarily just the infinite canvas, but all those things that you were sort of talking about at a very specific point?
Well, I know that both Douglas and I are going to be talking a little bit about hope and disillusionment. That's squabbling couple. And in my case, it's interesting to see what stuff feels a little dated and what stuff doesn't. Understanding comics, if I'm a one-hit wonder, that was definitely the hit. And understanding is definitely the thing that most survives for me. There's some other stuff that I've liked over the years, but that's the one thing I continue to like. And one of the reasons is because it's reasonably timeless. Because I openly and deliberately avoided any linkage to any specific technology, any specific medium. And it's funny, if you go back and read Understanding Comics, I never mentioned computers once. And almost as soon as the ink was dry, I was down the rabbit hole for the next 10, 15 years. Its follow-up, Reinventing Comics, where I explicitly talk about comics and digital media, I think is the book where even though parts of it are still pointing to a potential future, it also suffers a lot for having been very of its time. I think probably at my best when I'm dealing with principles that are they're just out in the Oort cloud, They're just this idea, you mentioned this notion of chaos and order, and the idea that we're transitioning into a world that's much more about these emergent patterns of this crazy mass of behavioral, organic, really just it's an aesthetic butterfly effect or whatever. But one of the things for me is that, in a way, I do actually belong to the linear crowd. My dad was an engineer, and what happens with me is that I look at the noise and the rumble of all these things going on, and it sets off these flashes that are illuminating there's some kind of shape in the sky of some universal principle, and that's what I keep looking up and seeing, is there any eternal principle that's actually going to apply? Principles only, not outcomes, right. Not steady states. There are no steady states, but there are steady principles. And I think that's what I was looking for in Understanding Comics, was trying to find what principles can apply across the board, and they still kind of work. They still matter because I stated right up front, this has nothing to do with paper. This has nothing to do with companies. This has nothing to do with characters. This has nothing to do with all the things that were 99% of what everybody had written about previously. This is just boiling comics down to its essence. But, of course, I get in trouble for that because there are many people who feel that boiling anything down to its essence, and eventually you boil everything away. There's nothing left. There is no essence, and which I don't actually necessarily disagree with. Chip Delaney talks about the futility of definitions. I try to define comics. What is comics? And there are many people who feel this is just a foolish thing to even try because you'll never define them perfectly. Delaney talks about the notion of a functional description. But I think, at the very least, I think the exercise is worth it. And also, you can never take away one definition and replace it with another. All you can do is add, and you just okay, this is definition number 4, after the funny animals and the juvenile delinquency and the stapled superheroes. Did that make any sense at all?
Yeah, I mean, and there's nothing wrong with doing that either. It's there as long as you accept that it's provisional. It's great. I mean, the only problem is where you start to is when one starts to institutionalize those definitions. I remember I wrote about it way back in the same book I was writing about your stuff. I was writing about the first sort of world champion snowboarder guy, and he refused. He was this European guy, and he refused to snowboard in the Olympics. And this was in like 94, 93. And he refused because he didn't want the sport to get legitimized and locked down too quickly. He thought it was a sport that was still evolving, and that once you do the Olympics, and so he basically lost what would have been millions of dollars of whatever you get, your sponsorships or endorsements, because he cared more about the evolution of the sport. But comics have been, it's sequential art. It's been around long enough that it deserves its sort of Aristotle poetics moment.
But we do have, inside of comics, we definitely have that same attitude, the snowboarding attitude. And it's never gone away. There are many people who see, as the moment a comic gets hung in a museum or wins a Guggenheim grant, it's just like, oh man, there goes the neighborhood. There are a lot of guys, there are guys in the underground who still, they're not too crazy about Artie Spiegelman. That Artie, he's getting into museums and he's hanging out with these hoity-toity types and he's ruining everything. And this is a very common feeling that it's robbing us of our vitality.
Yeah. But comics, I think, luckily, is more resilient than most other forms of media because it's so born in the gutter as well. Because it's read, under the blankets at night with a flashlight. It retains, for all of us, it ends up retaining something. We were talking outside before, but on the one hand, I love to complain about this being a movie industry conference, farm team on some level, and you get the sense, certainly if you work for the bigger publishers, that your work is just loss leader for the 1 out of 10 that's going to get an option from someone else, But I feel like the sort of corporate media conglomerate America is consuming the comic industry at its own risk, at its peril. That unlike the music industry or the book industry or the film industry that they bought before, comics is so rooted in alt-dot culture and in resistance and in dangerous memes and in just deeply, delightfully fucked up people that they will be incapable of digesting this, and that we will be the pill that changes them, I think, more than they are the jacket that changes us.
Cool. Okay, I have 2 responses here. Number 1, remind me to come back to the Rostock's Manifesto, okay? Just remember that term. Yeah, thank you, Marianne. Okay, because that's the shorter answer, but first the long answer that I'm going to forget if I don't. If I do that one first. Okay. Oh, damn it, I forgot. It was...
Contextualization.
Oh, yes. Okay, all right. One thing, though, and that is, I think, now more than ever, the industry and the medium it's just this. The industry is this sort of smaller piece of that Venn diagram, and because of self-publishing on the web, where we have tens of thousands, and every time I say that word, tens of thousands, this is not just an expression. There are tens of thousands of people making comics on the web. So you have that, and you also have the small press aesthetic that doesn't really care what's happening at the majors, particularly. And so I think that it really can only be co-opted to a degree anyway. And the fact is really that we have these different tribes. And we're always going to have the tribe that's struggling for legitimacy, and we're always going to have that countercurrent of those who are embracing their illegitimacy. And there are always going to be ways, through content and style and approach, to reassert that regardless of what the general public thinks of the medium as a whole. Even if, yeah, we're being hung in museums, but there's still this crazy guy out on the corner saying, buy my comics! You know, and he's still there. It's like, so you're always going to have those countercurrents within the different tribes. And I really think you're going to have the iconoclasts, you're going to have the rebels, but then you'll also have the neo-traditionalists and the storytellers. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting going on in the late 90s and the early aughts is that we started to see this resurgence after a decade of rebels, formal rebels and social rebels, the undergrounders and the formalists, the crazy mad scientists like me and the guys doing comics about picking their nose and masturbating or whatever. Okay, so we had those were kind of dominating the progressive wing in the 90s, but then in the late 90s, early aughts, suddenly we had this neo-traditionalist movement and people like, a lot of the manga readers, manga artists, or manga influence artists, and people like the guys in the Flight Anthology. And they took a completely different attitude, and they were, more like Steve Root, who was just in here, where it's just like, I'm a storyteller. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. I'm learning from the past. I'm trying to perfect these ideas, bringing some of mine onto the table, but it's a much more humble approach. These are all part of the ecosystem, and they all react to each other. So that's the one answer. But the other thing, the bitter pill, the Rushkoff's manifesto. This is not new. The idea of yes, let them swallow us. we will get them for that. This is not new, even in comics and even in modern comics. Matt Groening, who created The Simpsons, was part of this bunch of like crazy reprobate merry pranksters that include people like Gary Panter and I think Charles Byrne, Linda Barry, and I think Gary was mostly, but I guess the others were signatories to it. They were the signatories of this manifesto called the Rushkoff's Manifesto. Find it, read it, it's great. Find it online. And what it is it's just basically, essentially the message is, sell out, become part of the machine, and break the machine from the inside. And they did it! These are the people who did Pee-wee's Playhouse, the guy who did The Simpsons. These are people who actually succeeded in infiltrating pop culture and breaking down the machine. So that's the bitter pill thing.
Right. I mean, and the trick that the traditional lefty gets upset by that, because they'll say a kid growing up in a Simpsons world may not actually sense the subversiveness of the Simpsons, that it's just mainstream culture to them. And then you've got to ask, well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, I'd rather be raised in a world where The Simpsons is mainstream than when Father Knows Best is mainstream, right? Because they're still getting the joke. But does it, in that sort of, what's it, Ford wrote, was Conquest of Cool. Is it a conquest of cool and such a mainstreamization when Bart Simpson works for Rupert Murdoch? What does it mean finally? When you look at the way money is flowing through the system.
Although I have to say, in the Simpsons in particular, I think they may not get it when they're 12, but they may get it when they're 25. It's like right now there's like some 47-year-old guy my age, like sitting in a living room, is just eating his TV dinner, and suddenly he starts laughing for no reason. And suddenly he just says, Peeper Cleaver, oh my God. Like he got it. He finally got it. So some of these are time bombs.
Yeah. We can hope. But yeah, at least future generations will get these things.
I thought about my kids, we do the media literacy thing at home. Ivy says, no, we didn't really watch America's Next Top Model as a teachable moment. We disagree on that. But the commercials, we definitely... No, you didn't watch it all, so how would you know? But we stopped.
Yeah.
Though Winter's getting into Project Runway, which is much better. But we did look at the commercials, and we did talk about it. We still, to this day, with my kids, we talk about commercials. So, there is a way to engage with it, even when pop culture is messed up.
The part of the web part that still disturbs me, and this is, I don't know, as a classicist or a Jew or a localist or something,
how about all
three? I came up in the zine era, right? When it was, you made this thing, you basically you were a temp for a legal firm, is the way you did it. And you made this thing on their time and Xeroxed it on their stationery and mailed it out to Tower and the other places who took it on their postage and FedEx. Which is basically the history of zines. But there was a hand-to-hand, living, real-world, connected quality to it. There's something about going to the Comic Legal Defense fund party and getting a hand-stapled copy of Fart Party from the girl who wrote it. It is, and a good one. That creates a sort of a local connection between people in a real way. That's part of what I love about comics, that they're physical, that they have object value, that can, not necessarily, but can be lost in a world that's so already alienated and isolated by media that online comics doesn't, for me, suffice as comics culture. I'm still looking for ways, and this is manipulative, I'm still looking for ways to force people to have physical engagement. And comics, for me, were one of them. Handing comics, trading comics in that sort of baseball card way that we had when we were kids. The boys, we sat in the back of the bleachers, under the bleachers, while the regular kids were playing sports, and we traded and did these thing. So I'm looking for ways to revitalize the live culture of it.
Okay, I got two answers to that one. Write down Fort Thunder. That'll be later. Okay, all right. So, two cases. I'm going to give you two cases. Tell me which one sounds more connected, more sort of symbiotically linked. All right. In my day, because I'm old, but I mean like when I was doing comics in the 80s, right? I would draw in my room all alone. And then I would take these oversized Bristol boards and I would send them off. And then those things would be scanned. And then, if it was in color, a bunch of old ladies with X-Acto knives in Passaic, New Jersey would cut out ruby lith and put it down and, eventually be separated, whatever. The thing would go out. And, a month later it would be printed. And people, while I'm, going off and having dinner or working on the next book, they would be reading the thing. Then they would write down letters on pieces of paper, and then they would send in the pieces of paper, and eventually the post office would get it to me, and then I would open the pieces of paper. I would read the pieces of paper, and then maybe I would type in what they wrote. Okay, and then that would be printed in a letters column, and then there'd be some back and forth. Okay, that was my connection with computers. And then I would go to a convention once a year, maybe twice, and I would meet them. Okay, compare that to I am sitting in front of a glowing screen. This glowing screen is connected at all times to a huge cloud-like neural, organism, on the other end of which, one of many other ends, is another person sitting looking at the glowing screen. And I say, read my comic. And they read it, and a moment later they say, you misspelled invulnerable. But I really like the face in panel 3. Which of those is a more profound connection?
You're the creator. You're supposed to be living alone in the gutter, unhappy, turning out these things and emerging maybe once a year, pale-skinned and undernourished, to a group of fans who are social and have had great experiences and had sex even based on the work that you created. That's your plight.
Stuff a lot like that has happened in both scenarios, by the way. But here's the Fort Thunder thing.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the things that happened is, when I started, in 1982, 83 or so, I really got started. 84, my first book came out. I never said, at that time, I'm going to make comics, and I'm going to make them on paper. Okay, I did not make that statement. I did not internally, externally, whatever. I just said, I'm going to make comics. Paper was a foregone conclusion. Okay. One of the things that happened in the 90s is, suddenly, paper became visible for the very first time, because there was an alternative. There was this intangible alternative. And people looking to paper became aware of its tangible properties. And if you go back to the mid-'80s, right, when I was doing Zod, there were virtually no beautiful paper comics, except for Spiegelman and Mooley's Raw. Virtually nobody was doing anything interesting with paper, because the whole idea was, well, I just want to get my ideas out, my stories, and, this is the way I do it. So we picked cheap paper or semi-cheap paper. If we wanted the colors to show up, we had to pick slightly better paper, but nobody gave a shit what it looked like or felt like. And then suddenly in the 90s, they did. And all of a sudden, because there was this intangible alternative, people like in a house in Rhode Island, would be doing these silkscreen Dayglow comics, silkscreen on denim, and cut up and hand-stitched with twine, with these Dayglow comics about Godzilla, and they would be handing them out because, look, it's a thing. And that mattered suddenly because print was actually visible.
Right.
It mattered. And that's what I see now, is that if you go to the small press shows like MoCA and Ape and SPX, and now Stumptown has been getting more interested lately up in Portland, you see that real love of the physical.
Right.
And then concurrent with that, you also see this enormous social structure of cartoonists who are all reading each other, not only reading each other's works, but reading each other's blogs. And they know what the other one had for breakfast, and they know who's upset and who's sick and who's pregnant and who's been fired. They know all of that stuff, and they know it on a day-to-day basis. And I see that also as a more profound connection, because I've seen it when those guys get together. They're even more like family than we were. For one thing, they can all go out to dinner without having to agree to meet at the lobby at 7 o'clock because they have cell phones now. And it's just, I just see a much more profound connection of the professional community, the professional to readers, and also even of readers to the objects. And all of them either directly or indirectly because of the web.
Right, because it's still an ecosystem. You don't necessarily lose one to the other. If they deneutralize the net and we lose our ability to do the things that we currently do with it, without being part of some big company that's paying for the bandwidth, we still have the real world, right? On some level, I don't mind if Barry Diller takes over and the net world, because they're very rapidly forgetting about flesh and blood reality, except for wars and oil. I mean, they're losing track of what people actually say to each other in the real world, where life takes place. So I just like reminding people that there's this other virtual reality called flesh, where you can do stuff, you can have talks if there's no microphones around. I mean, you can get away with a lot in the real world that you can't get away with out on the internet now.
It's true. And if privacy is really going the way of the dodo, it may be the only way to have that connection without going on the record.
Right, Colossus, please give us privacy. He turns off his little light. Remember that? And they have a little conversation.
No, I just got so lost in my own thinking right now. Douglas, I actually want to go back to this point that you were making earlier about the internet, just because it strikes me as somebody who's like, you're a serious blogger who responds continuously to community. I don't know if I necessarily buy what you're saying entirely, to be honest.
About what?
Just in general about your disappointment with the internet and web communications, and just your sort of general disappointment as this entire technology. The technology has become boring at this point, so really what we're looking at are like how we construct these social interactions and what people do with it. The whole blah, 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 user-generated movement, all that kind of stuff is obviously the thing that people talk about most at this point. But I'm curious as to where your disengagement lies with it really at this point in terms of some of what you're saying.
Two things. One, experientially, from 1984 to 1994-5, when I would spend time online, and this is FidoNet through Netscape, when I turned off the computer, I felt more alive, more connected, like I had more friends, invigorated, to the point where I couldn't sleep. If I did an internet session from 8 to 2 in the morning, I was, let's eat, let's go outside. Now, when I do 2 or 3 hours on the internet, almost no matter what I'm doing, I feel drained and tired. I responded to all this, and I did all that, and I got through all that. My connection's faster, things are brighter, everything streams, but I don't. So I feel like I'm losing prana. It's a net prana loss as opposed to a net prana gain. So there's that experientially, which certainly clouds my view. And as a person who came up as a writer, celebrating the internet, I feel more obligated maybe to respond to every email I get, every junior high school student who asks me a question about their paper, even if it's as inane as, I have to write a paper about your book Media Virus. Tell me, what's it about? I'll write a paragraph to them as to why that email really isn't a good email to have written. I'll explain that to them. Because you have to. What else are you going to do? But when my 6 a.m. to noon is taken up with those email responses, and then I have a 3-year-old daughter of my own, and I end up with 2 hours to write. So that's one. The other is my sense. What I liked about the online space was that compared to mainstream media, which was intentionally alienating and isolating in order to sell products to people who were alone, it seemed that the internet worked by connecting people to each other. And what I've looked at in the last 5 or 6 years is the bias of the internet to connect people who share common micro interests rather than any local interests. My big thing these days is what is going on outside your door? What is the local reality? Because the more local you become, I think the better chance you stand at fighting corporations who are really the kings of non-local activity. So when you realize that this car site that you go to would rather you be friends with someone who lives 2,000 miles away but owns a red 2002 Mini with a sunroof just like yours, that's the friendship you're going to have there, rather than just someone who likes cars who lives across the street. So I'm looking at that, at a particular bias of the internet socially now towards micro interests and the delocalization of it, and the failure, I would argue, of efforts like Meetup.com and Outside In to really invigorate the local sensibility. So no, I'm not against the internet. I use the internet. Without the internet, it would all suck. I mean, it really would. Things like Obama wouldn't even almost happen, much less maybe really happen. So everything. I mean, in terms of micro investment in campaigns. I mean, this is all internet possible. I'm just looking, because it's my job to do this. I'm looking at what's the continuing shape and shift of the bias of the media that we use. And the bias of the internet is shifting away from contact between people and more towards contact through content between people, and particular content that is less and less local, and just of concern.
I think it's a legitimate concern. It's something that I've been wondering about from pretty early on. I feel as if almost every current of that sort has a countercurrent, but I couldn't tell you exactly what it is. It's just that the degree to which it denies certain basic human needs and desires or has negative societal results, I think the web is pretty resilient about manufacturing a countercurrent. But I couldn't really enumerate exactly what it is. I don't think we're at the point in the history of the web where it's obvious. One of the things that has to happen is that if the web can close the gap on the local level, so that people we can have such a very resilient, maybe visual map of what's happening right now in a 1 mile radius. I think people will find that very hard to resist, and I think you would start to begin to localize that content again. I have to say, though, I'm still haunted by what I sort of think of as the many faces of Kitty Genovese. And McLuhan had talked about this when it was only television. Is that people, years and years ago, this notion that television has given people a sense of community that didn't require a place. It simply happened electronically on a global level, or at least on a national level. And that I believe he at least explicitly linked it to the Kitty Genovese incident, or maybe one of his acolytes like Tony Schwartz did. But Kitty Genovese, for those who don't remember, was the woman who was murdered, or was she raped and murdered? I don't recall. Raped and murdered in an apartment complex or a housing development of some sort.
I'm sorry, but are you certain about that? I just researched it, and I'm pretty sure she was just murdered. It is murdered.
Well, she was assaulted.
It took a long time.
We know she was murdered.
It took like 14 minutes or something of screaming.
There was some time, and nobody in the neighborhood of the dozens of people, maybe more, who saw and heard this assault, none of them wanted to get involved. None of them called the police. None of them did anything. And that this, in many ways, was linked to, and of course we will never know necessarily, but it was linked to this notion that they were just sitting at home watching their televisions, and that sense of community that had been really holding together communities of that sort only, say, 10, 15 years before, was eroding. So, I mean, in many ways, I just see that it's been going on a long time. Television brought us part of the way down that road.
Right.
The net is bringing us part of the way down, or
Part of the way
further down
back.
the road. Yeah.
In some ways, the internet
But then
was the counter-trend.
Right,
was the
because-
counter-trend to that. And that's why I think until 94, 95, it seemed like the internet was that. Then when the internet became the web, as you put it, rather than the net, it became a much more opaque interface. It was much harder to get it. It was much harder to participate. Other than sort of entering your credit card or clicking yes, it was about submit rather than
I'm not sure I see that.
IRC. I mean, no, the
Well,
IRC.
what sort of transparency are we talking about, though? Because there's the transparency to the system when it was all command line interface,
Right.
and we were logging on and putting, and we had a sense that, okay, we have this transparency between us and what's actually happening in machine language, but it was more opaque in terms of us getting straight to content or getting straight to each other, whereas I'd say that it's been replaced by transparency between us and our content, or us and each other, and
Yeah,
it's
but
that
I was
the system is
raised
more
Jewish
opaque.
in the text-only, text-only tradition.
Picture guy.
Exactly. But
so.
to me, so the original internet had no pictures. But to those of us who can't draw, pictures are opaque because that's like the thing that's sort of the special thing. It's more of an idol or iconic rather than texty.
It's great. It's like a one-way mirror metaphor. Sorry, it's a thing. I'm sorry, never mind.
It's not illness. It's a feature, right?
Oh, we're getting 5 minutes. Wow, really? Okay.
But I'm not neighing on the internet anymore. Really, what I'm neighing on is corporatism. I mean, that's really what I'm against. It goes back 400 years. It's the centralization of power and authority. It's being forced to run through a central authority in order to reach anybody else, to use centralized currency to sell something, to use a centralized publisher with a printing press in order to release anything. And it's not about everything having to be decentralized, but maintaining the ability to do true peer-to-peer locally in a decentralized way. Now, the internet is what makes me aware of where is there community-sponsored local agriculture that I can do my vegetable buying from. That's where I get that. I'm not going to get that on TV. I'm going to get an ad for Whole Foods Market. So the internet does give me, in some ways, the ability to be local in a way that I couldn't before, although I probably could have before by going downtown to my town and going, who knows about community-sponsored act? Oh, Hank probably knows about Hank. Who's the? Oh, you got to come with me. Come on, And Hank will tell me, But Hank is still there. That's why I moved to a small town now. There are people still there, and that is an interesting thing. My other fear is, and this was back to the thing about we were talking about the takeover of comics by something big or whatever. Is that what would happen to comics would be like what happened to what fame did to kids in the performing arts, what LA Law did to the legal profession. In other words, that if kids grew up in a world where they thought of rising in comics the way they now think of rising on American Idol to be a musician, or rising in fame to be a performer, that they just won't be as generally aware of the fact that there is a place for weird people to go and do this very special thing.
Others will know. I mean, any movement that's tangible enough, to coalesce into something that, that's sort of that broad and solid is going to be solid enough to cast a shadow.
Right.
And you'll always have the counter-trends, you'll always have the counter-tribes, and you'll always have those who look at that, see it for what it is, and pull even harder to go in the opposite direction.
The question is, will that be the mainstream of comics? But right now,
usually it anticipates the future mainstream. I mean, it's usually those kids, it's the kids who are just saying, Pat, I'm not going to do that. They're running the show in 10, 15 years. Or at the very, how much are we tools of the undergrounds now? I mean, how much, of what was going on in the 60s still it has become part of our DNA. So it's usually, that's how it usually works. I'm not worried. Of course, I just don't really worry about much of anything, except the panopticon, except for certain government. That's something else entirely.
Well, you could meta worry also.
Yeah.
You could worry about the
I
fact
could worry
that you're
about
not
worrying.
Yeah.
Disasterbation, yeah.
Whatever gets you off.
Quick, change of topic.
Well, actually, because we only have a couple minutes left, I do have one last question because I'm really curious as to what you're both working on currently and how some of these ideas and conclusions figure into this.
I always look to my editor if I'm allowed to talk about what
Okay, I was wondering if you were going
I'm going to do another comic that I can't talk about, or they'll yell at me. But I'm working on a book right now called Corporatized, which is looking at really the 400-year process through which people internalize corporate values. You know, I no longer think of us being run by, I don't think of corporations as real, but I think a lot of us do. And even on the left, we look at corporations as these real things that we have to bring down, rather than just ourselves as corporatized humans whose values and mindsets have become, you know, we think of ourselves as sort of individual corporate actors. And how did that happen? You know, from King Henry the Navigator through Bernays. You know, how did that happen? And now, what can we do about it to reassert collective human agency in the face of a highly individualized, corporatized society? So that's how I have my fun right now.
I've got a few things going on right now. I'm I'm about to pitch a graphic novel that'll be 300 or 400 pages long. It's a story I've had in mind for about 20 years. It takes place in New York. It's very operatic. I can't tell you much more than that. I have a thing going on that I really can't tell you anything about because it's non-disclosure stuff. And then I'm also putting the finishing touches on a collection of my series Zot from the 80s, which is a 576-page collection of every single page of the black and whites. That's coming out beginning of July, and I have a panel about it tomorrow at 3 p.m. if you'd like to swing by. And I'll be talking about that and also showing you Kurt Busiek's high school yearbook photo. And talking about what it was like growing up a nerd.
Can I say one thing before we finish? I just want to, on behalf of anyone who feels the same way, I want to thank you so much for planting a flag in the sand, really. It was to find this book at the right time of your life, for someone to say, yes, I get it. I so get it. This medium is so special. I mean, for those of us who want to work in it, and everyone says, what are you doing? You're going to work in comics? What are you doing? We've got this to show them. And when you're feeling down and out or blue, you can pick up this book. And you can. And it can make you go, this is why what I'm doing is important. You know, this is why what I'm doing matters. And so thanks for that. It changed me.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Mary Ann.
I'm going to say, actually, every year I give it to about 40 students, and it changes them every year, too. I also make them read you as well.
And thank you, Douglas, for planting your flag, by the way, as well.
Do we have time for any questions at all? Nope? Okay. Sorry.
Oh, I didn't even think of that. Catch us outside. We'll be like...
Or on the internet.
Yeah.